Well, good afternoon, March for Life. My name is Katrina Gallick. I'm a Special Assistant for Communications here at the March for Life, and I am joined today by Ingrid Duran, who is the Director for State Legislation with the National Right to Life Committee. So thank you for joining us, Ingrid.
Thank you for having me on the show.
So this afternoon, Ingrid and I are going to be speaking about partial birth abortion and the partial birth abortion ban of 2003 that was upheld in 2007 on this day. So this is the anniversary of the Supreme Court deciding in Gonzalez v. Carhart to allow the partial birth abortion ban to go into effect. And so just a little disclaimer going forward, we will be speaking about partial birth abortion and the medical descriptions of it. And it is rather gruesome, so if there's any children that are watching, just a disclaimer about that. So just to kick it off the bat, Ingrid, if you just describe a bit of what you do with the National Right to Life Committee.
Hi, so I am the State Legislative Director for the National Right to Life Committee. I assist all of our state affiliates in enacting pro-life legislation in different states, and also trying to defeat pro-abortion legislation like New York's extreme abortion on demand policy, the Reproductive Health Act that recently passed. And I try to provide them with enough tools, talking points, polling data, fact sheets, and sometimes I go and testify in the state legislatures on behalf of certain bills. You know, the National Right to Life Committee has priority bills. In the 90s, it was the partial birth abortion ban. And most recently, it has been the Pain Capable Unborn Child Protection Act and the Unborn Child Protection from Dismemberment Abortion, which is another equally gruesome procedure to the partial birth abortion ban.
So on that, could you explain briefly what is partial birth abortion and how did it first get started being practiced here in the United States?
Well, that's an excellent question. And actually, it's one that is really dear to my heart, this issue, because when I first started working at the National Right to Life Committee was when Congress first introduced it in 1995. And so a partial birth abortion procedure is a procedure that's mainly done in the 5th and 6th months of pregnancy and onward. So this is a very developed unborn baby. And what the abortionist does is that, guided by an ultrasound, the abortionist delivers the baby in a footling breech, so feet first. And he leaves, or she leaves the head inside the mother. And what the next course of action is that he would take a pair of Mesobond scissors. These are surgical scissors. And they would poke a hole into the base of the skull of the unborn child. And the hole would widen. And after that, a suction catheter would be placed inside of the hole, which would suckle the cranial contents of the baby's brain, and that would allow the baby to pass then through the vaginal opening. And it's a very gruesome procedure, and you're basically just talking about like a mere, you know, maybe 4 or 5 inches of infanticide, of having a live birth.
Wow. So was this something that was a very common practice? I know there's always lots of debate when it comes to these late abortions. You know, I know how often was it done?
Well, and the way that this started, I'd like to backtrack just a little bit, is that in 1992, an Ohio abortionist by the name of Martin Haskell wrote a paper in the National Abortion Federation and another journal just depicting this type of procedure. And the way that he described it was that it was a very efficient, fast, an outpatient procedure. So it wasn't shopped as this is a case for, you know, when there is a medical emergency or when there is, you know, where the health of the mother is concerned. It was just seen as a very convenient way to terminate the life of a child. without having to, hospitalize or have to be an inpatient procedure. And so when someone anonymously dropped this paper in front of our offices, the National Right to Life Committee sprung into action with Congress and started drafting a model bill on how to eliminate this procedure and only have it if the mother's life was in jeopardy.
So are there cases then where the called intact D&E or DNX or partial birth abortion would be necessary to save the life of the mother or her general health?
No, what we found, even though our opposition in the beginning, part of their misinformation campaign was to say that this was happening on severely deformed babies, that this was happening in cases of medical emergencies. What we later found out when a whistleblower by the name of Ron Fitzsimmons, who was the executive director of the National Coalition of Abortion Providers, he just said, I am tired of touting the party line. This procedure is being done on healthy mothers of healthy fetuses, a majority part of the time. And then the other thing is that Martin Haskell, when he was talking about it in interviews, he said that 80% of the time this procedure was purely elective. Those were his words.
So yeah, so clearly, as you're saying, this was out of convenience, and then it was a quicker way to have abortions on more women. So you mentioned it a little bit, but could you just dive deeper about the road from when this was first come to the attention of National Right to Life to eventually the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act? It's a mouthful. That was signed by President Bush in 2003. So could you just go through that long and arduous road that the committee so courageously led?
Sure. So the first time that it was introduced in Congress, we had a very pro-abortion president, Clinton. And so it did pass Congress, and he vetoed it. And so what started to happen then is that states started to say, hey, let us take a crack at this and pass state partial birth abortion bans. And Nebraska was among one of the first states to enact a ban. And if some of the viewers may recall, the very first partial birth abortion Supreme Court decision was the Stenberg versus Carhart decision, which struck the Nebraska partial birth abortion law. And so then what happened, I mean, I believe it took about maybe 7 or 8 years before Congress was actually able to pass it, and it was signed by pro-life President George Bush. And so what ended up happening was in the process of debating this in Congress and in the states, our opposition, as I said earlier, they were saying that this was necessary for medical reasons, and just kept exposing, why that wasn't accurate and why that was a lie. And we were able to provide documentation. There were hearings that a lot of information came to light. Another misinformation campaign that the opposition had was also that the anesthesia that's given to the mother kills the baby. And so you had to have two prominent anesthesia organizations, the head of the anesthesia, the American Anesthesia, I forget the acronym, I'm sorry, but
we'll put it in the comments later.
His name was Morg Ellickson, but the head of one of the main anesthesia organizations, medical associations, just said that is an outright lie. It would be impossible, and he had to come out and speak out against that, because then women who were having their babies did not want to get anesthesia because they were afraid that this was going to kill their baby. But that was another lie we were able to expose from our opposition. and let them know that no, these babies are alive up until those scissors were inserted and their brains were being suctioned out. And so, so this just continued to happen, and the National Right to Life Committee and the pro-life community just basically really stuck together. And what I think is really important about this piece of legislation is that up until 1995, the abortion debate had always been surrounded around a woman's right to choose. And this was probably the very first piece of legislation that really focused on the humanity of the unborn child, the developing unborn child, and why it was so necessary to ban this horrific procedure and protect unborn children from being put to death in this way. And so I thought that was a very pivotal point, because up until then, the baby was always discarded as a piece of tissue and non-human. And this really allowed us to humanize the unborn child. And so finally, Congress was able to send the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act to a pro-life president, and they did tweak it. And because of the earlier debates, we had more congressional findings in the new bill. We had a different definition of what partial birth abortion meant, so that it wouldn't be considered as vague by any court. We also tightened the health exception to the partial birth abortion procedure. So it still had a life of the mother exception, but it also had a more narrow health exception that we believed would be upheld in court. And 12 years ago, we were able to put that theory to a test, and the pro-life movement prevailed, because the Supreme Court decided that it was, the two central holdings in the Carhart versus Gonzalez decision, was that the state can limit abortion and uphold the integrity of the medical profession, and that the state does have a compelling state interest in protecting the life of an unborn child of a fetus that would become a child. And so that was really important for us.
Yeah, and so it is definitely a day to celebrate this victory in the courts. And you bring up a few times the misinformation or disinformation that's carried around a lot, and this is something that the pro-choice movement continues to do. But what's amazing is that, as you're saying, the more we shine the light on the truth of what abortion is, and also the humanity of the child, and this is something that science continues to prove more and more and more. Now there's 40 ultrasounds that show so clearly the humanity of the little one, and so it's becoming more and more difficult for the pro-abortion side to really deny that truth. And so that is something that gives, I think, it give us in the pro-life movement a lot of hope, is that science, and they're on our side. And so we have that to lean on. So with this, the decision of Gonzalez v. Carhart, could you explain a bit about how that impacts pro-life legislation moving forward?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the legislative priorities for the National Right to Life Committee over the last couple of years have been the Pain Capable Unborn Child Protection Act. So this is a piece of legislation that would protect unborn children who are capable of feeling pain, which is about 20 weeks post-fertilization age. And we felt that because of the wealth of information that we received during the partial birth abortion hearings, this really set us up to say, hey, why don't we see if there is a compelling state interest? This is a brand new question. The court has never addressed this before, but it is to see whether or not if the state has a compelling state interest in protecting the lives of children that are capable of feeling pain. Another piece of legislation is the Unborn Children Protection from Dismemberment Abortion. And that came from a lot of the transcripts from the Stenberg versus Carhart and Carhart versus Gonzalez, where Dr. Carhart, a famed abortionist who is known for performing abortions late in pregnancy, just talked about the gruesome nature of the dismemberment abortion.
Mhm.
And so, and this is an abortion that is being performed on a live unborn child. And again, guided by the ultrasound, what the abortionist does is that they start to tear off limbs and start sectioning off the baby. And the baby is basically torn apart limb from limb. And to death. And so, at the time, Justice Kennedy was saying that the very gruesome nature of this is that the baby dies just as a human adult would. It just bleeds to death as it's torn limb from limb. And it was very jarring, even for me, to just read the transcripts from this court cases, because the way that Dr. Carhart is discussing it is very cavalier. And at the end of the day, we have to remember that he's talking about a member of our human family, And so we believe that because of the decision of the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court precedent established in the Carhart versus Gonzalez case, we believe that the dismemberment abortion, which is currently being challenged and will hopefully make it up to the Supreme Court, we believe that we will also prevail there, that it is constitutional to bar such a gruesome abortion procedure, and that as Americans, states do have a right to protect the ethics and integrity of the medical community by banning such a horrific procedure and protecting unborn children from being killed in this manner.
Absolutely. Yeah, so just as you're saying that the partial birth abortion is gruesome, but all abortion is, because all abortion, the goal is to kill the child, and that is always lethal, and very gruesome. And so what lessons do you think broadly the pro-life movement can learn? You mentioned a few as you were speaking before, but what lessons do you think the pro-life movement can learn about how to protect unborn child and their mother from this case of the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act?
So I think that one of the biggest lessons that we learned with the partial birth abortion debate is the humanity of the baby. There was such a spotlight on the baby that this really paved the way then for ultrasound legislation. And also, I believe that after 1995, or even after 2003, you saw more public opinion polling favoring common sense protections for unborn children and their mothers. You had more people that were willing to support, even people that were quote unquote pro-choice, really were able to support a ban on such a horrific procedure. And these were the same people that could kind of come around and see later on, when we had the Unborn Victims of Violence Act with the Lacey Peterson Act in Congress, it kind of gets the mushy middle. And so you were able to see people that were saying, yeah, if you harm a pregnant woman, it should be 2 counts of assault or 2 counts of murder. And also, and that also paves the way for legislation like Pain Capable Unborn Child Protection Act and the Unborn Child Protection for Dismemberment Act. And I mean, all of these pieces of legislation, I think, really drive more people not only to become pro-life, but it really drives the abortion numbers low. And I think that we're starting to see that in the numbers where the abortion rate and ratio are falling. More people are choosing life, and more people are choosing to say that they're pro-life, that they actually do have a problem with abortions up until birth, and that they really do see the unborn child as a member of our human family that needs protection.
And we saw another interesting case about that recently with the 2 viral videos coming out of Virginia, one from Representative Delegate Kathy Tran defending her extreme abortion bill, and then following up with Governor Ralph Northam, who on live radio makes comments that seem very much like supporting of infanticide. And these videos rightfully went absolutely viral, and people cannot believe that they were hearing. Although we know in the pro-life movement that this has been the agenda of the pro-abortion movement from the beginning. But it was very interesting. So you had Knights of Columbus ran a poll that they do every year in January, and then they did a follow-up poll asking the same questions: do you consider yourself pro-life or pro-choice? And they saw a 16-point difference from January to February during the time when these videos were going viral. More people deciding that they would consider themselves pro-life. And so I think it speaks very much to exactly what you're saying, that the more we can point to the extreme nature of the pro-abortion lobby and the humanity of the child, that people start to think very much the positions that they may have held for a long time, and are so much more likely to consider themselves pro-life and to choose life when they're in those situations. So what advice would you give then to our viewers who want to make a difference in their own community? They want to be part of this, but maybe don't know how to get started, or to have the confidence to speak about these issues. So what advice would you give them?
I would say that it is really important to stay connected, not only to the National Right to Life Committee and its affiliates, because when there is a bill on the floor, sometimes we have zero time to act. And so we'll put out an alert, whether it's congressional or our state affiliate might put out a vote and say, hey, like right now in Kansas, they just sent abortion pill reversal information to the governor, who we believe may veto it. And so it's important to let the Kansas governor know, hey, don't women deserve this information? Don't women deserve a right to know that halfway through the chemical abortion process, it may be possible to reverse the intended effects of a chemical abortion? And, this is now the law in 7 states. Oklahoma has recently just sent it to their governor. We expect her to sign it. And so I think it's always important to stay grounded and to be the voice for the vulnerable. Because right now, where are their allies? Where are the allies for these babies and their mothers? And so it's really important to stay connected and also to educate people beyond our base. It's always great to engage with your friends and let them know what occurs during a dismemberment abortion, because if you allow our opposition to define the terms and to describe what is going on, they will say things like empty the contents of the uterus. They don't say dismember a live unborn child with a beating heart that has brainwaves, that can feel pain, that, they won't say anything to that sort. So we have to speak to the truth to what is actually occurring during an abortion. And one of the things that I really value about the legislation that the National Right to Life Committee pushes is that there is always an educational value to the legislation that we're pursuing, so that it's not enough to just have a law that protects unborn children. You have to engage the minds and the hearts of the public so that they understand why these babies need protecting.
Oh, absolutely, beautifully said. Thank you so much for joining us. If there's anything else you'd like to add before we head on out for the weekend?
Well, if you want more information and history on the partial birth abortion, I would invite you to go to www.nrlc.org. We have a tab in the federal legislative link on partial birth abortion, and the state legislative link. We also have some information on other pieces of legislation, and information is power. And so I would just encourage everyone to please be informed. Please, keep us in your prayers, and continue to be a voice for the voiceless.
Wonderful. And we'll put that link in the comments too. So be sure that people go to the website and find more information about partial birth abortion, other legislation, and ways to get involved. So thank you so much, Ingrid, for joining us.
All right, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope everybody has a great afternoon.
All right. Bye-bye.